All right, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started here. Well, welcome to our next panel. This panel is the Complexities of Cyber Attribution, and we have a star-studded panel here. We're going to start with the session chair, Niloofar Howe. She's a senior operating partner at Energy Impact Partners. She's a venture capitalist, has been an investor, been a venture capitalist in technology generally, and also in cybersecurity for about the past 15 years. Welcome, Nilu. Thank you. Yeah, come on. Okay. Next we have Dr. Ethan Bueno de Mesquita. He is the dean at deputy dean at the Harris School of Public Policy and a Sydney Stein Professor. He's an applied game theorist who's written broadly on terrorism and rebellion, cyber strategy, electoral accountability, and social science methodology. So these are a lot of things that we've already been hearing about, and we look forward to hearing more about. Welcome, Dr. Bueno. Okay. Next panelist is Rob Joyce. Rob Joyce is the director of the National Security Agency, the Cybersecurity Directorate. He's the director, in that agency, the National Security Agency Cybersecurity Directorate is charged with preventing and eradicating threats to the U.S. national security system and critical infrastructure with a focus on the defense industrial base. Welcome, thank you. All right. Okay, next we have Kevin Mandia of Mandiant. He's the Chief Executive Officer and Director. He was formerly the Chief Executive Officer of FireEye that had acquired his company and basically integrated that. Welcome, Kevin. All right. And then our final panelist is Jules White. He's an Associate Professor of Computer Science and Engineering here at Vanderbilt. Welcome, Jules. He's Associate Dean of Strategic Learning Programs in the School of Engineering and Associate Professor of Computer Science in the department. He's also a National Science Career Award recipient. Welcome. All right. Okay. And so at this point, I'll go ahead and just turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Owens and Chancellor Diermeier, for the opportunity to have this conversation with sort of a cyber dream team representing academia, government, and private sector. And we're going to turn to the question of cyber attribution, which is, in the public conversation, not getting as much attention as it deserves, and it's such a critical aspect of defending against cyber attacks. And Ethan, I wanted to start with you because you've written one, maybe the only academic paper on cyber attribution. And in it, you say that our ability to maintain peace through deterrence rests on the idea of a credible threat that's sufficiently strong retaliation in response to an attack. The principle is pretty straightforward when it comes to kinetic attacks and traditional means of warfare. Not so much when we're dealing with electrons, when we're dealing with cyber warfare. It's a little bit harder, it's a little bit different. Can you tell us a little bit about the paper and sort of set the scene here about cyber attribution?
Sure, thanks. It's lovely to be here. I'm glad we're talking about this stuff. So as you say, I mean, like sort of the general theory of deterrence, I think, is pretty straightforward and easy to understand. You're supposed to threaten to hit people who hit you, and if you threaten enough, then they won't hit you in the first place. That's the idea. The trick, I think, in the cyber domain, and cyber is not, I think, unique in this, but it brings it to scale and makes it sort of a first-order concern for national security, is the problem of attribution. That unlike a missile, which we say comes with a return address, a cyber attack doesn't necessarily. And I think that does a couple things to thinking about deterrence and national security strategy in general in the cyber domain. There's one kind of obvious thing, which is if you're not sure who it is hit you, then they're not sure that you're going to hit them back even if you, right? You may misattribute the attack, and so deterrence is necessarily weakened. I think that's the obvious implication of attribution problems for the theory of deterrence and our ability to keep ourselves safe. But I think there's something slightly more subtle, which is that attribution problems create sort of a more difficult strategic environment in a broader way. So the way I like to think about this is there's what a social scientist would call a complementarity, a kind of synergy in cyber warfare that comes from attribution problems. So if one of our adversaries becomes more capable or more active in the cyber domain, then whenever a hard-to-attribute attack happens, they're sort of more suspect. If the North Koreans suddenly are sort of way more active in the cyber domain, then whenever a hard-to-attribute attack happens, we're slightly more suspicious of the North Koreans. And if we're slightly more suspicious of the North Koreans, that means we're slightly less suspicious of somebody else, say the Iranians or the Chinese or the Russians. And if that's true, then it becomes more tempting for those other adversaries who we're going to be less suspicious of because we are more suspicious of the North Koreans, themselves to become more active in the cyber domain. And that means in cyberspace, unlike in, say, sort of more traditional or conventional deterrence, the worse we become at deterring any one of our adversaries, the worse we become at deterring all of them. Because as one adversary becomes more capable or more active, they all are tempted to. And I think if you think about the current environment, where we have not just nation states, but incredibly active non-state cyber groups, and increasingly so, attribution becomes harder. As those groups become more harder, it becomes more tempting for more such groups, and sort of the spiral of this complementarity that comes from attribution problems becomes worse and worse. So I think that's kind of a first-order strategic effect of attribution that we weren't used to dealing with in more traditional forms of deterrence.
So I'm actually curious, I'm going to overly simplify this, but Kevin, if you're kind of responsible for attribution in the private sector, and Rob, you're kind of responsible for attribution in the government, how do you think about what Ethan just said?
So I think the concept of attribution as a key element of the deterrence factor is really important. And earlier today we had General Nakasone asked, what do you make of the Russian aggression or lack thereof in cyber? And I totally agree with him that there was some really astronomical cyber pressure brought to Ukraine and their networks by Russia in this. So don't be dismissive that just because that didn't come directly at the U.S. as much as it has Ukraine, that we don't have a major event. Right now, we've got an environment where those cyber attacks around Ukraine are pretty blatantly tied to the Russian aggression in that space. So for attribution, the key elements are who, what, where, when, why. And the why is pretty apparent in that space. So the dynamics change based on the environment as well. So it's not just the technical capability or who has the biggest, baddest cyber program. You've got to go through all of those elements of attribution, and motivation is a key aspect as well.
Kevin.
My opinions on attribution, I think it's the way I look at it. We've been trying to do attribution at Mandiant since we started in 2004, but it was mostly from a forensic capability. When we go in and we respond to breaches, we codify all the fingerprints we see, and we just try to marry it up or match it to pre-existing cases we had worked or investigations we had done. But it became obvious to me, even in the 90s, that you're never going to solve a cybersecurity issue with technology alone or people alone. There will always have to be a diplomatic way to hold nations accountable, or nations hold their citizens or people accountable to behaviors and norms. So that's why we have over 350 threat analysts at my company trying to figure out, as we respond to breaches, who might have done it, why, both based on tangible evidence that we see, as well as maybe patterns from the past or agendas. And I just leave it with this: attribution will be critical. Obviously, without deterrence, all activities will continue. If there's no risk or repercussions to offense, then it's just going to continue forever. So if you look at the ransomware problem, you kind of like to see that go away. Ransomware is going to require attribution. It's going to require holding nations accountable for harboring those actors, and we just got to get it right. And so if I had to write a paper on attribution, I'd basically just say, we got to get it right, because without it, we'll already see incidents, and we won't know how to proportionately respond when we see those incidents. We won't even know who to respond to. So critical element. I can't say it's getting harder or easier. I feel it's getting different, but we have a 20-year body of work to compare anything we see to, and I think it's just really hard because most threat actors are active every day, if they're professionals. And when you're active every day, it's hard to just overnight, boom, we're totally different tomorrow than we were yesterday. It's such a hard shift that, for the most part, if you want to not be attributed, you have to do a lot of work and probably only use those TTPs one time. And maybe that would create a challenge for us. So bottom line, we'll do our best in the private sector to do it. I do think it's a group effort, and the government and the private sector together hopefully can give a good picture to folks as to who's behind some of these breaches.
So Kevin, since you talked about
Yeah.
if you were to write a paper on attribution, you
It's
guys...
probably one paragraph, because that's all I got.
Well, so...
It's not a paper, it's a paragraph.
Well, you guys pioneered public attribution with the work you did attributing Chinese APT1 with the report you all
Yeah.
wrote. How did that report come about? Were you guys challenged? Was it accepted? What was the reaction to it?
So for those of you that don't know, first off, I wasn't sitting around saying, we're going to pioneer public attribution. What we were doing at the time in February of 2013 is we had spent from 2005 to 2013 responding to threat groups from everywhere. But one threat group we had responded to 141 times. Same exact people. They were out of China. They were hitting our defense industrial base, and they were compromising companies doing mergers and acquisitions in China. So we felt nation against a commercial entity is not a very fair fight. So whoever's doing shots for the word asymmetric, you can do a shot now. The asymmetry of a nation going on offense against a company is just wildly unfair. And we don't want to set the bar that all of us run companies that will prevent and deter a nation state-based attack. Maybe utilities need to. So the bottom line, why did we do that report? At the time, Mandia was 350 people. I would say probably over half were former military. And we just felt it was the right thing to do. We felt we didn't see bilateral dialogue. We saw the country talking about China doing these breaches. I remember the House Intelligence Committee had a hearing in November of 2011, and Congressman Mike Rogers said something about, we got to do something about China. We just felt it'd be a useful tool. We threw it out there. We knew that people wanted to do information sharing, and the culture of Mandiant being a lot of, at that time, military folks, they were like, we got to do something about this. So that's 2 reasons out of 7. But we wanted it to be useful to show folks how to do good information sharing. Here's who's doing it. Here's what they're doing. And we tried to do it during the Chinese New Year so that they'd all come back from their New Year celebration with their whole infrastructure burned.
Can I pick up on something about this?
Of course you may.
So I'm interested in this because I think that you said this, the thing about, which I think is so important, about we don't want each individual country having to deter a nation-state attack. And I think one of the interesting things about the cyber age is the extent to which, in a way that is unfamiliar from the rest of life, national security has to be privatized in this way. That in fact, we live in a world in which, whatever, not just power companies and utilities, but Target and our banks and everybody has to defend sort of certain kinds of critical infrastructure, our credit card numbers, our social security numbers that they have access to, and so we depend on private companies to shore up our defenses against cyber attacks. And I take your point that in sort of big cases like the one you're talking about, or Sony Pictures, where a nation state acted in this way, and you can publicly attribute, then you can maybe hand back deterrence to the government. But in lots and lots of smaller cyber attacks, it seems like, in fact, we are exactly depending on the private sector to shore up our defenses on a kind of a permanent basis, which seems like it must mean we're massively underdefended, because those private companies don't have the same kind of incentives that our government does to shore up national defense. I'm just interested in your thoughts about, like, how bad is the situation in terms of private security, the needs of private security in securing our national defense in the cyber age.
Is that a question for me?
Yeah,
I
you
just
brought it
think,
up.
I like it when
Yeah.
when the moderation moves, actually. This
Sorry.
is great. No.
Well, to me, you can't defend every playground, and it's totally unrealistic to think we can defend everybody in cyberspace right now. Maybe someday, and you can be hopeful for that. So you do have to have a deterrence, and I think the key would be for the organizations that can't defend themselves. They lack the resources, lack the knowledge, and they are targeted, because if you're on the internet, you're targeted. And I think we probably all are. I think it's important for the government to have visibility into that. So as a nation, you can respond to the growing accumulation of victims that are being impacted, so you can understand the size and scope of the problem. And I think that's what we're seeing take place now. Because the nation needs to go to other nations and say, hey, listen, you cost us $2 billion last year allowing your criminals to compromise us. Are you going to do anything different, yes or no? And just at least we can try diplomacy and try relations. If we're dealing with a nation that's just not going to arbitrate that, over time you will see us continue on the path we are on as a nation, which is every company, when they learn about the cybersecurity risks, are trying to do something about it. I'm not sure there's a lot of companies ignoring it. And I've heard people say, oh, people aren't taking cybersecurity seriously. I'm not running into those leaders at companies.
Jules, you've done a lot of work on physical systems. Can you tell us about the sort of unique complexities of cyber attacks and cyber attribution when it comes to physical systems?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work on cyber physical systems at Vanderbilt. And these are basically systems where you have software interacting with the physical world. So things like the braking control software in your car, or software that's controlling the machines in a manufacturing plant. And so you have this sort of tight interaction between the software and the physical world. So one of the interesting things I think about attacks on these systems is that you have sort of your understanding of the physical world that you can use to help detect these attacks and also to try to differentiate between normal failures. So you may have things that look like, the power grid probably fails in different places every day, but is this failure something that looks like what you would expect based on the physics and how the system behaves? So I think one interesting area is kind of understanding how you can use your understanding of the physics and the physical world to help defend these systems, particularly when it's so unknown, if something's secure from a cyber perspective. I think the other thing that's interesting about these systems is that, from an attack perspective, is that we really still think of them in terms of physical, sort of a physical mental model. So, people think about their car and they think, I press the brake on my car and there's some physical linkage that's going to stop the car. But in reality, you're probably pressing on the brake and you're asking software to slow you down. And when we would ask somebody to go and say, is your car safe and secure, they'd probably drive it to the dealer and have the dealer inspect it and look at if all the physical components are okay and completely ignore the cyber side of it. And I think, from our ability to be able to, as a society, look at and make sure these systems are secure and safe, we're really, really behind. So if I wanted to take my car and find out if it had a cyber attack and if the software was okay in my car, I don't even know how I'd go about doing that. But that it's a safety critical system that I depend on. And we're also, we think of these things as physical systems. We think it's a great idea to put software in them, and we're accelerating our, how many of these systems we put software into. You can go and buy a smart oven now that connects to your Wi-Fi. But we're way behind in terms of our ability to, make sure that they're safe and secure, to be able to actually know that we can trust it. And then when I turn it on, it's going to turn on, and when I turn it off, it'll still turn off. So I think, there's a big gap in what we can do in terms of what we've done in the past in terms of physical guarantees of security and safety versus what we can now do with these cyber physical systems, where we know that the software also is secure and safe.
You bring up a really interesting point, which is, as we move into a world of a hyper-connected ecosystem, we're saying there's going to be somewhere between 27 billion and 35 billion connected devices within the next few years, and the entanglement amongst systems. And Rob, I'll throw this to you, but open it up to the whole panel. How do we distinguish between failure versus attack, between intentional consequences that require a certain set of responses versus unintentional consequences?
Yeah, so I think that's always the first question when an incident happens is why, right? And the people that own and operate that infrastructure, their first responders are trying to figure it out. It's often them that appreciate that something is out of the norm and this is not a normal failure. In the intel community, we're often trying to look over the horizon at the threat actors, the nation state APT groups, some of the organized criminal groups, and know in advance their intent. And that is the capability that the government can bring, is knowing that there is pressure on a specific industry or a specific company or a brand new technique. You'll see NSA and CISA, NSA and FBI partnering a lot these days to talk about the threats, because we know there's an intent to a critical infrastructure sector. Or there's a series of TTPs that this specific group is using. And if you can take and blunt those tradecraft, you can be secure against their normal focus and capabilities that they're going to bring.
If we look at some of the events that have been in the headlines, whether it's Colonial Pipeline or it's NotPetya or it's Saudi Aramco, the proportionality of the response for there to be deterrence requires really distinguishing between what the intent of the actor was and what happened. In all those cases, the intent and the outcome were different. I don't know who wants to take this up, but how do we ensure proportionality of response to have deterrence when these incidents can go in directions that were completely unintended?
Well, part of it is focusing on that intent, right? NotPetya, so a Russia attack on Ukraine. Their intent was to cause pain in Ukraine, but they didn't care that it spilled over to the rest of the globe. And so, part of the attribution and the follow-on imposition of costs is to try to drive those norms to say, hey, you've got to be careful with your cyber operations. And this is unacceptable to have something aimed into a theater of conflict and have it spill out globally, causing massive damage, threat to life, and all of the complications that came with it.
I think the spillover thing I think is interesting because the way that we build these systems is we use reusable software components. So we don't go and start from scratch. We use Windows, and you could go into a manufacturing plant and there's going to be Windows there as well, running some of these machines. And so when somebody develops an attack on Windows, they're inadvertently going to have the ability to attack all of these other systems, which they may or may not have intended to go after. And so I think one of the tricky things is sort of because of the way that we reuse software all over the place and we don't start from scratch every time, it's kind of inevitable you're always going to have some spillover when a new capability. And so one of the things you kind of have to look at is like, does the attack have something specialized that was targeting this thing? Is it attacking this 3D printer in some sophisticated way, or is it just the fact that it's running on Windows and this thing happens to be able to attack Windows as well? So I think it's inevitable that we'll see that because of just the way that we reuse software and attackers try to go for things that have broad reuse.
Colonial was different though. Kevin, can you unpack Colonial for a second with respect to intended versus unintended?
Well, I think, I'm going to speak more vaguely, I guess. When I think about intentionality, I do think if you're on offense and you're professional, there's ways to put guardrails on what you're doing. And that's an overt decision that you can make. I mean, we investigate and reverse malware every single day, and we find fascinating things in malware that help us fingerprint the doctrine of nations, quite frankly. Like if we find North Korean malware on a system, if we try to reverse it, it tries to destroy our system. It looks for like 5 or 6. Are you single-stepping through this process in a debugger? If yes, delete the system. If you're running in a VMware, delete the system. So that's a doctrine decision by the nation to say, we're going to destroy people that try to reverse our malware. We're just going to wreck the machine. It is so easy to put the guardrails on that I would expect every modern nation that's on offense to do so, unless they want to deal with unintended consequences, or they have to accept the risk of an unintended consequence in the cyber domain. So then you get to the criminal element. They probably aren't going to, I've never actually seen guardrails on criminal software, so it's going to work and do what it's intended to do, probably without IP range restrictions or time delivery restrictions and other things that they could do. You have to hold the nations accountable that are overlooking and condoning criminal acts. Nations, in my opinion, I'm not a diplomat though, I'm a cybersecurity professional, but in reality it seems to me, as with my third grade diplomacy mindset, that if nations don't abide by common rules of engagement harbor criminals that are making billions of dollars, they can't be part of a global economy. They can't be part of that economic advantage. So there's got to be other tools that we can pull. So when I think about unintentional consequences, shame on the offense. Think about it. Now, I do recognize there's going to be risks sometimes, depending on the risk versus reward equations, where offense may have to do something, but all I can tell you is you can guardrail it.
So you raise an interesting question about proxies. And so, for example, are Russian ransomware gangs proxies for the Russian state? Ethan, I'm curious, from a deterrence perspective, and again, proportionality of response and cyber attribution, how would you think about how proxies behave?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how bad you think the attribution problem is and exactly how norm-following states are. So I think the problem with, like, there's lots of sort of policy proposals out there along the lines of let's hold states responsible for all cyber attacks emanating from their domain, things like this. And that, of course, that has some appeal from a deterrence perspective. People are responsible for things that they might have been able to control, and it also has some strategic risks. And in particular, it makes us manipulable. This is kind of one of the standard worries about proxy warfare in general. But if it's in fact the case that we're going to hold the Chinese responsible for everything coming out of China, and they control some of those groups and maybe they don't other, then we are manipulable by groups that want to foment conflict or want to foment trouble. And I think that is what, and so this depends on both how hard the attribution problem is and how much we think we know about how much control these states really have over their proxies, or whether or not there are quasi-proxies in the way we think of, say, with Iran and its non-cyber quasi-proxies, who, you know, they take money from Iran and they take some direction from Iran, but also they have a mind of their own and they do some things that Iran wouldn't do. And if we worry about that in the cyber domain, I think we should worry about a deterrence doctrine that says, let's respond as though all the things that look like quasi-proxies are the states. They were responsible because we are manipulable into very dangerous escalation, I think.
So to do that well, we need near-perfect attribution. Rob, how good are we at attribution? How precise can we get? How good are we relative to our friends and our foes?
So attribution is absolutely hard, absolutely hard. But when you see something like the US government come out and give attribution, that is a super high bar, super high level of confidence.
What's the bar? I mean, when there's a missile attack, we can pinpoint where it was launched from, and we know where it was launched from is actually represents the people behind the missile attack.
So when you get a White House podium statement that X did Y, like we did with, you know, everything from Sony Pictures to NotPetya, that's 100%. And there are techniques for attribution, right? There's the technical components. You worry about the malware type used, the infrastructure type used. But remember, the U.S. government, you know, will partner with the commercial folks, the victim data, to get that kind of detail of what was used, how it was used, what attributes it has. But we also bring other things into the mix. We will bring things like our foreign intelligence, where you might get the direction from leadership ordering something to be done. You may get the battle damage assessment of how effective it was. You may get them talking about the diplomatic crisis of, oh my gosh, you know, people are conjecturing it is us. What are we going to do to deny it so it doesn't get worse, right? So that is the added value that the government brings on top of the consortium. And you mentioned, you know, friends. We do this in conjunction with, you know, partners and allies. And oftentimes we try to bring them into, you know, international condemnation for some of the worst acts because of that intent to drive and set norms. I think one of the interesting pieces, people worry about false flags. We're really good. Kevin mentioned, you know, how hard it is to do operations each and every day and then totally change the next so you can't be attributed. So as we're out there working as governmental intelligence capability, we see how they operate, where they operate, what they do, and we're able to follow with a pretty good trail. A good example is the Olympic destroyer malware. So 2018 Pyongyang Olympics, devastating wiper deployed in South Korea, and everybody's assuming it's North Korea. There's traits in the code that have North Korean DNA. So, you know, the immediate first reaction is, got to be North Korea. We unpack that a little more. And even in the overt malware, you find out that, hey, it turns out there's these obscure header compile time information, little seeds and trails that show, no, really not North Korean.
How long did that take?
It was fairly fast. People dove into the details. And again, one of the things that happens in these is people want all of the detailed evidence laid out. And so I remember 2014, the Sony Pictures hack. So that was November. By December, we're out as a government attributing that to North Korea. It's funny because industry was saying North Korea, and then as soon as the federal government said, yes, North Korea, the industry tone and tenor on Twitter changed and said, here's all these 5 other ways that it probably isn't, right? And they just veered hard off left because the government made an attribution and said, well, we don't trust the government piece. So again, we layered in not only the technical pieces, but all of the other things we could understand from our intelligence apparatus. And so it's an interesting dynamic, but we're not going to put the pieces in the puzzle all out on the table. That compile time header, right? They won't make that mistake again in the case of Olympic Destroyer. So it's important that we hold back some pieces, but not continuing to evolve their tradecraft and show them where they made the mistake each and every time.
But the Olympic Games attack should also, I think, make us worried. I mean, that is to say, like,
Olympic Destroyer?
Yeah,
Yep.
because we figured it out and we attributed it correctly. And also, in fact, the North Koreans were attempting to engage in a false flag operation. And it's not like this space is full of actors who are norm followers. They didn't do a great job of it, and you guys were able to back it out. But they're out there trying.
Yep.
And the strategic environment is like that.
So have we seen successful false flag operations or technical misdirection that wasn't unmasked pretty fast, where it stayed in the public domain for a while?
I don't know of a big one. And so I also won't say that there's never been one, because those are the ones that did slip beneath the radar. But again, it is that complete body of evidence where it's the combination of the technical indicators, but also all the way up through what can you find out about plans, intentions, or operations through the intelligence.
So Jules or Ethan, as we think about, one of the tools that adversaries have is this deceive, deny, as they carry out operations. So even when we make attribution, even when the government makes attribution, even when the private sector, comes in behind and says, we are certain that, North Korea, Iran, China, Russia were behind a particular attack, the adversary may deceive and deny in order to stay below the gray zone. What are the issues and complexities with these deceive and deny operations, and can we unmask them pretty fast?
Well, I think it's interesting hearing about the way other intelligence gets brought in to help understand these things. And I think there was also, an interesting point that I'm actually probably have questions on about, you see they can't switch operations super fast. So you're going to see a sort of probably, and maybe this is incorrect, I'm curious if this is the case, but incremental sort of change in behavior, because you can't build all the software overnight that you would need, all the tools that you would need, or all the expertise that you would need. You have to sort of evolve over time. So I think it's really fascinating that, sort of some of the technical details, sort of the expertise details limit how quickly they could suddenly change and say, well, we're going to do something completely new. And so if you've built up over time evidence, both from the technical side, but also connected it to intelligence and kind of established that this pattern is a particular actor, I think that's really fascinating that then, because they can't just rewrite everything from scratch, redo all of their training from scratch, or however they do this, you're not going to suddenly switch over. I think that's a fascinating aspect of this that I'd be curious or do you see big changes in how people operate overnight, or does it tend to be incremental?
Totally incremental. I mean, I don't even know if it's incremental. Some groups we've responded to, we show up and we're like, oh, it's them in 5 minutes. And it's not, like, we don't go through every reason why we know, but I'll give you an example. Some groups, when they hack in, they literally review files alphabetically because that's how it shows up on their screen, and it's manual. Other groups break in and they always bring keyword searches with them. They're very economical in their movement. They'll search for like 10 keywords, they leave with no curiosity and they come back 5 days later and retrieve responsive documents based on their keyword searches. So you've got, the first one is a Chinese group. They have the labor, they'll sit there and someone's on a keyboard the whole time for 8 hours straight going through your files, and they'll steal the whole directory if they see one file that's interesting most of the time. Whereas if we see another foreign intelligence service, they're just taking 3 files from this directory, 2 files from that directory, with far more economics and movement. And by the way, there's 20 other trace forensic residue type things we look at to get attribution, and the operators on the keyboard don't change overnight. Some might do ls-al to look at all the contents of a Unix directory. Some are ls-la. Go ahead and change that if you really want to get OPSEC, but you just start noticing the tradecraft of them. And then in the malware, tons of things about their environment. Do they statically compile, dynamically compile? What libraries do they commonly use? Ultimately, there are a lot of reasons why I think if you are a modern nation and you have a group that goes on offense, you want to be surreptitious, but you may not want to be unattributable, because I do think you can impact doctrine. So it all becomes, do you want to influence the behavior of nations and how they behave? I do think cyber domain does signal the silent intention of nations now. If there's going to be conflict in air, land, sea, and space, you're probably going to see something in cyber ahead of time. But I think it's one of the last rules of the playground that a modern nation may not want to break, because they don't want everyone doing false flags and going, oh my God, do the Chinese hate us now, or is it the Russians that hate us? Like, we can all probably masquerade as each other relatively effectively. My gut is there's going to be a 5% delta even on a great op where you're like, I'm not quite sure it's them, But I don't know. I think there's a decision calculus to be made before you genuinely are non-attributable. All I can tell you is right now, when we see some foreign intelligence service groups, I think they know they're wearing their jersey when they're doing it. They just want to fool the public, but they don't want to fool the professionals that are actually responding, because they don't want to change the dynamics between nations.
Why not?
Because who knows what will happen? Is it an escalation? Is it, I think they also don't want the reciprocal of it. It's something that if one nation starts doing it, potentially becomes a tool for every nation. And then you can't, if everybody does false flag operations, I don't even want to think about that right now. Rob, do you want to think about that right now? If they were all good, we'd all sit around going, so what did we learn from this? I don't know. Spain's hacking us and they're doing the same things the Russians used to do. I don't know. Right now, I think the false flag ops, for the most part, have to be limited to the 4 to 5 very active nations on offense, though, and I don't think you're going to be able to bring a new country into it effectively.
The biggest challenge I see in the attribution landscape changing recently is the biggest challenge is the use of commercial and publicly available tools. So when somebody drops into the background noise of all the criminal activities, it makes it really hard. And we've seen that after several of the attributions to North Korea. They changed, and again, it was incremental. It wasn't a light switch. They changed to the use of a lot of commercial hacking tools. And what we saw with that was a lot of the commercial firms at that point are losing track of the specific smaller elements within the DPRK hacking teams, and having challenges with attribution. Again, that doesn't eliminate if you're able to see command and control, strategic intent, the assessment of what it went, or how the outcomes of that material moves after it's stolen.
And I have to jump back in too, because I thought about it on the attribution. The other things go with that. To me, if you do a false flag op, you're escalating, period. And you're making a choice. And by the way, proxies are so much easier. Why bother with the technical hardships of a false flag? Just use proxies. That seems to be working pretty well right now. The second thing is, another rule that would go with that is the changing of data. I don't think modern nations yet really want to break in and make you not believe the data you're reading, because none of us wants to deal with that. So I think those are lines that, when crossed, every nation's going to go, oh boy, we went there. And it's just going to be a problem for everybody. It's going to be a problem for the United States, for China, for Russia, and it's an equitable problem, I think. So I think the boundary of what offense is going to do is unknown, but I think those are two things I've never seen really well executed: is a great false flag op and the desire to manipulate data in a truly malicious way. Manipulate data to cover your tracks, yes. Manipulate your data so that something really horrible happens, and it's a lie, it's a change of data. I just think those are uncharted waters still.
Can I pick up on this question of like the cyber and changing the nature of the relation between states? I was thinking about something that both Jules and Rob said about the attacks that we, like we don't know if there's been an attack on our braking system in our car, or the attacks that were below the surface and we in fact didn't know about, and thinking about the relationship between states. We know of examples, certainly, of attempted or successful attacks on, say, DoD computer systems. We suspect that the United States itself perhaps has been inside the computers of some of our adversaries' defense systems. Or we think about Iranian centrifuges or whatever. And so if you think about sort of just more broadly the way that like we think about the world peace being kept, it really rests on this idea that for a long time we've had a very good sense of one another's capabilities, and we've reached, for the most part, a kind of negotiated peace that respects that balance of power and rests on our common understanding of one another's capabilities. And in a world in which it could be that my adversary is inside my computers, and in fact my missiles won't launch, although I thought they would, and they think they maybe know they won't, or maybe I've reversed it and they think it won't. We live in a world potentially where it feels like a Pandora's box has been opened, where there's a lot of uncertainty, potentially, about one another's capabilities to defend or attack. And that feels kind of quite generally destabilizing, independent of this kind of norm following in the cyber domain itself. The possibility that cyber tools are unobserved and are inside our defensive systems in ways that mean we don't have a common understanding of who's ahead and who's behind, and that the negotiated peace, therefore, may not reflect our understanding of one another's capabilities, feels to me like a potential change to the fundamental relationship between states that the cyber age introduces, even if it's not fundamentally actually about the use of cyber weapons, other than in this way that they may underline our defensive capabilities. So I don't know what to do about that, but this topic of the...
Is that a true statement, that we don't have a great sense of how owned we are, or how what our capabilities are relative, both defensive and offensive, right? Relative to other strategic adversaries?
I mean, a world in which we could use cyber weapons to disrupt North Korean missile launches is a world in which they are uncertain of their capabilities vis-a-vis us.
So let's talk about tech transformation for a second. What tech trends could fundamentally impact our ability to attribute, could enable successful false flag operations, even if they're happening today, at a scale that would be relevant from a national security perspective? Jules, you're a computer science professor. What do you worry about here?
Well, I mean, I buy some device in my home, and tomorrow there's going to be something else I really want, or my wife wants, and we're going to end up buying it, and we're going to bring it on, and we have no idea, in reality, how secure it is. And I mean, I think that's just sort of a fundamental place we're in right now, is we're behind in our ability to say that the thing that we're receiving is actually secure in some way. And I think we're way behind in that. And I think the more we get, going back to the cyber physical systems thing, I mean, this is what keeps me up at night, is, the day that my wife says, well, we're going to buy that smart oven and we're going to install it. And then we buy this thing, and 2 years later, whoever it is says, well, we're not giving you software updates for it anymore. And so then do I throw out the oven because it's not secure anymore? I think we're moving from this world where we have all these things where we depend on them based on our physical understanding of them. I buy my car, it's good for 150,000 miles, I'll drive it for 150,000 miles. But in reality, is it good for 150,000 miles? If I stop getting software updates and it's not secure, should I still be driving it? And I think we haven't quite moved into how we handle that. I think there's a big gap in, how we deal with things physically versus how we deal with cyber physical systems, where software is an integral part of the safety. And I think we're really behind on securing that. I think to fix it requires probably, from a CS perspective, probably requires rethinking how we build these systems and how we prove that they're secure. But that's not easy to do, and it's expensive, and so it's not clear that it'll happen.
It's interesting you raise this. So early in the Russia-Ukraine war, Russian car charging stations got hacked. They were defaced with a message that I'm not going to repeat here. relative to Putin. But it was the first time that there was an IoT hack in the context of an active war. So we saw exactly what you said, which is car charging stations became an attack vector during an active conflict. And by the way, it wasn't just a nuisance. Russians couldn't charge their cars or drive them. So it actually had a real impact. And we also have in Ukraine this hacker army, right, that's come together, 400,000 or so folks that are working, some in coordination with the Ukrainian government, some not. These are private individuals. If they're Americans, they may or may not be violating federal law as they join this hacker army. How do we think about this evolution in the context of attribution and deterrence? Who wants to take this on? Rob?
Well, I will tell you that, you know, the idea of the civil vigilantes joining in a nation state attack is unwise, right? I really think that is, it is, you know, as you pointed out, it's illegal, but it's also unhelpful because, you know, one of the things we talked about is we're trying to get Russia to take account for the ransomware attacks and hacks that come out of Russia and emanate. This certainly isn't going to make the State Department discussions with Russia of you need to hold your people accountable any easier.
You can't have the private sector influencing the doctrine between nations. You don't have us fighting on air, land, and sea without being deputized or part of a force and with an agenda and a mission plan. In cyber, you know, I remember testifying back in Congress in 2011 on the bad ideas of letting the private sector go offensive, and I had 8 reasons back then, but I'm just giving you one. It will impact the relationship between nations. So if you let vigilantes hack, as a leader of the nation that's allowing those vigilantes to hack, you're allowing your population to dictate your foreign policy with other nations, and that's probably a bad idea.
But the genie's out of the bottle, right? It's never going away. Like, this is the world we live in now.
Well, we don't have Americans hacking vigilante. Literally, I think the FBI would go after Americans hacking vigilante style and destroying systems. So I think the genie's out of the bottle, maybe in other nations, but I want to be clear, the United States, we're not vigilante hackers.
I mean, what's the right answer there, though? So if there's 400,000 individuals, non-American, who are joining forces in partial cooperation with the Ukrainian government to go after Russian systems, does their work attribute back to the country that they reside in, or does it attribute back to Ukraine? This is why we need policy and academic work in the area, by the way. And this is why we're holding the summit.
And I misinterpreted your genie out of the bottle. You're absolutely right in regards to the cyber domain. Anybody can participate in it and do whatever the hell they want in it, right? Whether they're breaking the law or not. So yeah, the genie's out of the bottle in regards to cyber showing the intent of individuals that want to be supportive of certain agendas. But the genie wasn't out of the bottle, in my opinion, of nations that are responsible condoning vigilante offense. I just don't think most nations are going to be like, hey, go do that. That's a great idea.
I think Ukraine is, though.
Well, Ukraine they have bombs landing in their nation. I think rules are changing at that point.
Anyone else want to take this one on? No? We're going to leave this for further academic work?
I mean, I just think that you're exactly right. I mean, I think that what I mean by the genie out of the bottle is that, like, this is what modern conflict is now going to look like. And we need to rethink all sorts of the way we think about national security policy and strategy in light of it, because it really does change things, and we can't stop it. So it's a technological change that is going to require doctrinal and strategic changes.
So we'll pull on the thread of national security in a bit, but let's talk about why attribution matters to the private sector. Kevin, when you guys are leading incident response, when a company's been hit, does attribution matter?
I think it does, to the extent of the first inning of every breach, leadership wants to know what's the zone of potential outcomes. And if we know who did the act, we kind of can help guide appropriately. Here's what you can expect. They're going to leak data. They are going to extort you. They are going to destroy things, because that's the kind of questions we get right out of the gates. What's going to happen next? So attribution helps from a planning perspective for remediation and the effectiveness of your remediation. If you have a codified response to a group you've seen 100 times, you probably remediate a lot better than a first or second time you're in conflict with that group. And then it might go to plaintiff lawsuits. Like if you're sued because you were compromised, and then the president gets on TV and says it was a nation that did it against you, it probably takes the wind out of the sails of those plaintiff lawsuits. If a military unit hacked you or a foreign intelligence service hacked you, I think most people recognize, if you're a restaurant, you're not going to withstand the Russian SVR compromising your network right now or in the foreseeable future. So I do think attribution go towards weight in lawsuits, and you will get sued if you're hacked, period. I think it really helps in remediation planning and managing how you respond. And then at some point in time, it's probably going to matter now for insurance companies. They insure, natural disasters, but they don't insure acts of war. And, so that's a can of worms that people will probably have to consider at some point.
Can you talk, and I know the Cybersecurity Directorate is delegated authority for defending the defense industrial base as well. What are the nuances for remediating against different adversaries? So how is remediating against Russia different than remediating against China versus North Korea versus Iran? And let's just take those four.
Yeah, well, let me just start back to the attribution elements, the who, what, where, when, why. Why matters. Is it an intelligence operation? Is it a profit-making operation? Or is it hold at risk so I can deliver an offensive capability? Those three different whys really describe what you need to expect next. And in the case of finance, you saw Colonial Pipeline ransomed with the intent of making money. That's going to drive what your engagement is and how you try to remediate and clean up. If it's an intelligence operation, we were talking just earlier today, all the way back, the OPM breach. That was in a Chinese intelligence operation. I laughed when I got credit monitoring. The Chinese weren't going to take that and try to go after my personal credit, right? They weren't going to open credit cards with my SSN and bank information. It was about getting dots and points so that they could then do other intelligence activities branching out from that information. But the most important piece, as you mentioned, for the Cybersecurity Directorate, is that hold at risk. And we have a responsibility to help secure the defense industrial base, but our weapons platforms and that military overmatch. When you go into battle, you want to trust your capabilities. You want to trust the systems that literally are life and death for the people who are relying on them. So the response to a breach is, have you lost your military overmatch? Have you lost the design where they can find a vulnerability or develop a countermeasure? All the way out to, can they deliver a cyber effect that would render it incapable of operation? And it is the subtleties of figuring out your thoughts on the way forward from that point where you lost an advantage to where you recapture the confidence and capability in the system.
What about in the private sector, Kevin?
Those
or Rob?
same three whys matter, right? I believe I gave you a Colonial Pipeline example, et cetera.
It just goes to risk. When you're hacked and you know it, the outcomes vary tremendously. Like Rob gave you an example of someone stealing your PII but not going to use it against you. It's just massively different than someone getting compromised and the PII gets posted online. So from the company victim perspective, you want to be able to handle your breaches quietly and discreetly without impacting your customers or to the public or to national security. Those breaches that are just aired out in the public are far more complex. So, and who compromised you kind of dictates whether you have a public spectacle to deal with or not.
So,
related to the three examples I gave, there's a fourth big one these days, which is disinformation or information manipulation. And that increasingly is another effect of getting into a system to take information and then use it to manipulate the environment.
So how much harder is cyber attribution when it comes to info wars? So actually mapping out information flows across platforms and networks and understanding who the real personas are behind those activities. Ethan, have you done much work in this area?
I mean, so I have, I've done some work with the tech industry on their governance problems about this kind of thing. I mean, in my experience, there is a lot of this kind of laying in wait. That is, you know, you create an online persona and you develop followers because you expect to manipulate the midterm elections, and you know it just looks like you're posting cat pictures for 2 years, and then all of a sudden you weaponize this account for misinformation. And I think that they think they're very good at recognizing it once it gets weaponized, but the problem with the spread of viral misinformation is, of course, that by the time it's weaponized, it's already too late. Like viral information, once it's out there, it's out there. Even if they draw it down, it's over because it's out there and it can be spread in other ways. So it seems like a it seems to be a first order problem for our democracy, certainly.
Right. That was another interesting lesson from Ukraine, was taking the first mover advantage in the information war space and pre-bunking. As General Nakasone mentioned, Putin's attempts at misinformation, disinformation, et cetera, was critical because once the info's out there, it's almost impossible to pull it back in and counter it. Another question. So once we have attribution, and let's say once the government has attributed, the public expects action to follow. I'm just curious from a policy perspective, have we been good at follow through once we've attributed? What's the sense here?
I can't grade our homework.
I know.
I will tell you, you know.
Rob, you spent time in the White House, though.
Yeah, but I don't get to talk about policy now, right?
Okay.
I am in the executive. I would highlight, you know, back to the question that went to General Nakasone about, you know, why haven't we seen more from Russia? There's a lot of dynamics, but one piece of it is we have achieved some deterrence, right? There is no silver bullet to deterrence in the cyber arena. But it all comes down to influencing decision makers' choices, right? The decision makers authorize operations, or they give funding and resources to the groups that do these operations, or they implicitly look away and allow them to do things, you know, with their resources or with their spaces. All of these actions, to include attribution, are designed at not the person who has the fingers on the keyboard generally. Now, indictments or the outings of them may have that direct effect, but it really is about that leadership chain. Can you influence them to decide that the costs outweigh the value, that the pain, whether it is brought through sanctions or international norms, or whether it is the threat of responsive actions in the same domain, all the way out to other actions we can take with all elements of national power. You know, cyber responses will not be deterred with cyber. That much is clear, right? You can't just assume a cyber bullet's going to stop the activities. But you've got to bring a whole portfolio of responses, and that's what, in the end, we're trying to do.
You think that the Russians think that there would have been consequences other than cyber consequences above and beyond the consequences of the invasion? I mean, there have been tremendous consequences, of course, from the invasion of a sovereign nation.
Absolutely.
And you think they were nonetheless deterred from cyber because of within platform, that is, there would have been cyber-to-cyber deterrence, or there would have been additional punishments associated with?
Whole of nation. Yep, the things the president
that it would have been viewed as an extra escalation.
Yes.
Jules, you talked about physical systems. Should we think about physical attacks on physical systems by a nation state differently than we think about cyber attacks on a physical system?
Well, I think that cyber is just a vehicle for the same types of, I think there was a discussion of like, what are they trying to accomplish? Is it intelligence gathering? Are they trying to destroy something? I mean, I think it's just another vehicle to achieve these same types of things. So I think if we would respond in a particular way for a physical thing, you know, to that act, I don't see why a cyber mechanism for achieving the same sort of result should really matter that much. I mean, if it's stealing information, if they'd stolen it with human, you know, gathering mechanisms is probably still equally damaging to some respect.
I think in the context, it depends too. If somebody detonates a bomb to take out a portion of PG&E or Con Ed, and that's why our electricity goes off, people get that. But if all of a sudden PG&E goes down and it's a cyber attack, the psychological impact across the citizens is probably going to be pretty negative. It's like, can planes go down? Will Con Ed go down? Will Southern Company? You know, so all these things, that's the only thing that's creepy about it is, I think, if we can isolate that it was a cyber incident and it would only work here, but I think we're going through a whole generation of cyber incidents where we can't put a boundary around the realm of possibility if someone goes on offense.
So I believe we're at the end of our time, but since we're at Vanderbilt, a phenomenal academic institution, if there was one place where we could help guide the academics to study and really drive outcomes that will matter in this space, what's the silver bullet? Rob, what's your wish list?
So my wish list is really thinking about what are the ways we build the international community response. Because we will often start with an event and everybody will say, yes, I agree, that's Russia or China, but I can't stand there with you because of the economic implications or the fact that I don't have the same intelligence you do. You can share your intelligence, but then it's still not my intelligence. How do we get the community to come together? Because when we stand together as NATO or the EU or shoulder to shoulder with other nations, we bring so much more response and capability. So how do we build those international partnerships?
With General Nakasone touched on that, and Jules, if you were going to ask Ethan to, from a policy perspective, to study an area, what would be most helpful to you?
Well, I'm still actually listening because I think this is really helpful to hear what we should be studying on this side. I think it's fascinating. You know, I would say actually the things that would be helpful to us is to as much one on the problems, you know, understanding what they are, to realistic representative data in terms of things that can be shared and to help guide what we do and make sure that it's applicable in terms of environments, scenarios, things like that. The more that we can get that makes what we do relevant and real and transitionable, I think is helpful. But in terms of the problems and what we should be studying, I'm sort of listening to the rest of the group.
And I know we're out of time, but Ethan, what would be helpful to your research? What do you need from Rob and Kevin?
So I guess I'd say after 9/11, the national security world did an amazing job, I thought, of reaching out to academia in very informal ways to learn what the first order problems were that war planners and policymakers were working on. Tons and tons of informal meetings between academics and people from DOD, people from the military and the like. I started working on cyber because in 2016 I got to spend a day at NSA just kind of hearing briefings from people. Here are the problems that are hard. Here's what we work on day to day. Here's the hard things. And I think that there hasn't been as much of that in the cyber world. And I think academics really need a sense not just of like the hard data or access to grants or things like this, but they need to know the people who are on the ground working these problems, what's really hard to them, what puzzles them. I think there's a lot of, it's a really rich area, and I think there's a lot of appetite to work on it, but I think that the outreach of these informal relationships that give people a sense of what are the important problems is like absolutely essential.
So I have a practical ask, not a research ask of academics, which is computer science degrees should have a formal portion that trains you in secure software development. Today, you can graduate with a computer science degree without ever understanding how flaws get into computer systems. So we want to hire people who are trained from the beginning to know what the vulnerabilities are so they don't introduce them from the start. So I am on a campaign with academia across the country to try to get that as a requirement. So please help me evangelize. Computer science degrees need that. And I realize, you know, you've got to throw something else out of the curriculum, but that's fundamental. That's got to be a base requirement.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right, thank you so much.